The Old Man and the Sea has some really interesting narrative devices, particularly for a master of them like Ernest Hemingway. And you can argue a lot about the success of the work. Hemingway was getting on in years, and this is essentially the last completed narrative work that that he offered before his suicide a decade later. And well, that he published. And the work gets a lot of ribbing for being a collection of some of Hemingway's most cliche aspects. Hemingway had been at the top of the game for quite a while, and he was ripe for some resentment, for some reaction against. And a lot of this book feeds into that. It offers a lot of the cliche Hemingwayisms that we've all come to sort of roll our eyes at. But it on many levels it is demonstrating a mastery of the form as well as a caricature of it. And it's worth reading. It is a great read for that. It was published in was it 1952, simultaneously in novella form. It's very short, and also in its entirety in Life magazine. He was given a grand cover story rollout for that. And it can be read in a single sitting, and I do advocate that. But slowing down occasionally and looking at it more deliberately, more slowly, sifting through the words than you would your average short story in a magazine, that has some value too. Now, of course, on the surface, everybody's roughly familiar with the plot. It is the story of an old man named Santiago, a poor old fisherman in Cuba, who goes out fishing one day after a long dry spell. He hasn't caught anything for a while. Times are hard. He hooks into a large marlin who tows him deep out into the open ocean. And eventually, after like 3 days of fighting this fish, the fish dies. Santiago lashes the fish to the side of his small wooden skiff, a small, essentially sailboat, rowboat with a sail, however you really want to call it, and then starts to return to port, and along the way, sharks come and start picking the carcass clean, so that by the time the old man of the sea returns to port, it is nothing but a skeleton lashed to the side of his boat. And this is the sign of great futility, but also because of the bearing of the old man, also very Hemingway-esque grace under pressure, and also a kind of nihilism that is undercurrent in everything that Hemingway wrote. That's the plot. And you can make an awful lot of it. It is a little simplistic. It is a little bit, at times, less than interesting. Does anyone really need to know that much outside of professional fishermen? Does anyone really need to know that much about the act of fishing? It has that social realist aspect to it, where it is a sustained look at a poor subsistence level fisherman who's all alone in this world and is enduring great hardships, and especially in his old age, is seeing a narrowing and narrowing of his life, and he is on the precipice of death at the very end. But the way that story is told, I think, is significant and does have a lot of value to it. Hemingway brings his signature style to a kind of, yeah, you could say apex, you could say nadir, but it is unmistakably Hemingway in the way he tells this story and brings in techniques from a variety of examples and experiments with all the ways in which he himself, in writing as Hemingway, that he can create significance, and in that way prod his readership into drawing meaning out of the bare words on the page, so that it's not really even Hemingway writing the story so much anymore, but goading the reader into producing an awful lot of the text individually. Chief among these, I think, is the scope of the work, and by that I mean the framing of each individual narrative element. The narrative is told almost entirely in close-up. We get this at times excruciating tight composition of framing Santiago. We follow him through this ordeal. The details are, in very Hemingway fashion, very minimalist. They're generally very material, very physical, very objective, and they are rendered with typically terse language, and always watch out for the deliberately, sometimes maddeningly neutral diction that Hemingway will employ. Specifically, always if he's going to use a verb, chances are that verb is going to be some variation of the verb to be, because everything else sort of colors what he's saying, and he wants it to be reduced to an absolute minimum of expression, so that it has more implied expression, let's say. But right from the start, this technique is foregrounded. You can see it in the passage. The old man was thin and gaunt, with deep wrinkles in the back of his neck. The brown blotches of the benevolent skin cancer the sun brings from its reflection on the tropic sea were on his cheeks. The blotches ran well down the sides of his face, and his hands had the deep creased scars from handling heavy fish on the cords. But none of these scars were fresh. They were as old as erosions in the fishless desert. Everything about him was old, except his eyes, and they were the same color as the sea, and were cheerful and undefeated. Very simple, plodding prose, almost, but I think very significant. He is staying very, very focused on deeply physical and very tightly framed elements there. The skin, the wrinkles, the blotches on the skin, all of that is deep, deep close-up. We are right in front of Santiago. He is right in front of us, and we have nowhere else to look. He dominates the frame, if you will. There is no other way to consider him. You can't see him in context to anything else. You can't see him in relation to anything else. He is it. We have to deal with him. The book is about him and nothing else. But also significant, I think, in there is the broader interpretations that have to come from that insistence on that narrow framing, from the rigid limitation of what we are allowed to look at, prompts speculation about other aspects, other narrative elements perhaps that are implied and are thus outside the frame. We are given a very narrow frame to look at, but that almost begs the question, what's happening just outside that. And that's where Hemingway finds his iceberg, the iceberg theory, where art is almost entirely about what is suggested beneath the surface, and we only see a little tiny bit projecting up on top. The exterior is the exteriority of the art is confined to this kind of sharply defined material nature, but the interior value of it, the suggested value, the implied value, is all hidden. That is like the soul of the work, and that focus on the eyes at the very end, of course, suggests that if the eyes are the windows of the soul, they are the material exterior through which we can perceive a enormous and, in fact, almost infinite interior value. It is, in its way, a presence of the divine, almost, in scope, within the material. And that's where he tends to really break off from the rigid social materialism and starkly socially constructed tenets of realism as a narrative mode. The topic of scope itself is addressed again in Santiago's dialogue with his young friend, the boy he is often called. I think his name is Manolo. We can read, "Where are you going?" the boy asks. "Far out to come in when the wind shifts. I want to be out before it is light." "I'll try to get him to work far out," the boy said. "Then if you hook something truly big, we can come to your aid." "He does not like to work too far out." "No," the boy said, "but I will see something that he cannot see, such as a bird working, and get him to come out after dolphin." "Are his eyes that bad?" "He is almost blind." "It is strange," the old man said. "He never went turtling. That is what kills the eyes." So here the two are discussing Manolo's new master, if you will. The boy has been following Santiago, learning to fish from him for some time. The boy's parents are saying, "No, you got to leave that old guy behind. He's bad luck. He's not caught anything for a while. We want you to apprentice yourself to this other guy." And the other guy is just more cautious. And significantly, he is said to be almost blind. We can interpret that a number of different ways, symbolically or whatever, but the text itself is sort of pushing us back, saying, no, don't get off track with the symbolism of blindness. It's got a physical nature. Santiago himself equates the idea of blindness with a distinctly physical condition. He's saying he never went turtling. That is what kills the eyes. The glare of the sun is what causes blindness. And Santiago is thinking entirely within that very materialist, very physical frame. But again, the shooting down of that so quickly suggests that, well, maybe it could be something else. Maybe this is the text working against the characters within it and saying, all right, maybe it is something else. And that whole notion of scope is wrapped up in that, because here they're talking about going far out from land to find the fish in the deeper waters, which is what the boy's new master does not like to do, but what Santiago generally does. That sense of scope is significant, but it also has the symbolic value of Santiago is the great voyager. Santiago is the great hero. Santiago goes where nobody else has the courage to go and does what nobody else has the courage to do. And so we can start to make that association, and that association becomes almost doubled down once we're told that we shouldn't make those associative associations, that we shouldn't go down those interpretive paths, but that we should stick to the physical, stick to the narrow interpretation. Well, the nature of humanity is perhaps a little bit more like Santiago in this, in that, well, we are going to go far out. We are going to reach for the unknown. We are going to reach into the abstract, if we have to find what is truly relevant to us. The old man is, however, very stubborn in pushing those limits and injecting a sense of scope into the broader point of his life, into the broader existence of his life, than the average person. He is, in this way, considered or is being set up as a kind of hero. That tight focus on Santiago, however, also implies so much else in that hero vein. We are told at one point, when the boy came back, the old man was asleep in the chair and the sun was down. The boy took the old army blanket off the bed and spread it over the back of the chair and over the old man's shoulders. They were strange shoulders, still powerful, although very old. And the neck was still strong, too, and the creases did not show so much when the old man was asleep and his head fallen forward. His shirt had been patched so many times that it was like the sail, and the patches were faded to many different shades by the sun. The old man's head was very old, though, and with his eyes closed there was no life in his face. The newspaper lay across his knees, and the weight of his arm held it there in the evening breeze. He was barefooted. Yeah, again, all told in very tight close-up. The rigid edges of Hemingway's framing are insistent, conspicuously so, and thus they call attention to themselves. And by doing this, they're implicitly demanding attention for the outside of the frame. In this passage, Hemingway dwells on the material characteristics of the man and the objects around him. It also front-loads the passage, however, with the word strange. That estrangement is, of course, the standard formalist technique of looking at old, ordinary stuff new. We're looking at it afresh, taking a fresh look at something that perhaps you had never seen before, which is another way of seeing within a limited object something infinite. That is the prevailing message of Hemingway art. You can see, of course, within this a Christological value. Jesus symbolism is all over this book. The association is always implied, never explicit. But just look at the items or the elements of Santiago that we are shown in a kind of montage almost. We're told about the slump of his head leaning forward as he's asleep, sitting up. We're told about his bare feet. We're told about how there is no life in his face. The wrinkles, the decrepit look of the body, all of this is suggesting, I would say, a crucifix. When you add all of those tight images up, they parallel the images of a crucifix in a kind of montage. The parallelism of Christ and Santiago is persistent throughout the book. Probably never more so than when he is alone in the boat at the end of the book, and there's an explicit reference to the wounds on his hands, like a nail going through them. He is consistently told to be sort of pushing back and almost resting and taking some respite by pushing back against the wood of the hull or the gunwale inside the boat, wherever he is, and it becomes a little over obvious, and it becomes, yeah, okay, those are groaning moments where it's just a little too forced. But still, the force is a matter of our interpretation. Hemingway seems very content on keeping the scope of the work very limited. We only ever really see Santiago, and these associations are a matter of our construction. Santiago references prayer a couple of times, but he says at one point, "I am not very religious," which invites all sorts of other associations in terms of, well, is he religious or is he not religious, but is he spiritual, and does he have an individual relationship with God, and does this, in fact, advocate for an individualized relationship with the divine? All of these questions come up, but his relationship to that is always very circumscribed. It is a function of us seeing that juxtaposition and making the connection. That connection is paralleled again, I would say, in the story whenever Hemingway goes off on a tear about Joe DiMaggio. Joe DiMaggio is set up at a couple of points. The references to DiMaggio at a couple of points throughout this tale as another exemplar of the hero, the champion specifically. And here I think it's important to remember that this was written in 1951, the year DiMaggio retired. His last years on the Yankees, he was seen as a figure of great dignity and grace. He always was, but that time had taken its toll. He wasn't really that great at running anymore. He had some physical problems, but he always rose to the occasion, an image of Hemingway-esque grace under pressure. And Santiago references that repeatedly, and you get that sense of the admiration for the figure of DiMaggio between both in the conversation that Santiago has with the young boy Manolo, and also the conversations that he has with himself out at sea when he's all alone. And the figures that he does raise in those moments between DiMaggio, the references to religion, and the conspicuous parallels to Christ, and Santiago himself. Santiago has a long memory of or reverie of his own youth as an arm wrestling champion, or campeón, as he puts it in specific Spanish, where he sets up his own identity with that. So we have a kind of triad or trinity of champions, of Christ, DiMaggio, and Santiago, all persisting despite physical suffering, all persisting in dedication to a kind of duty to meet that suffering without cowering, to meet that suffering with dignity, and to do what you have to do, which is what Hemingway always, always, always values. That rigid focus, however, on Santiago, essentially it never breaks. It is almost claustrophobic. Perhaps by the time we make it out into the open sea, it is just overwhelmingly claustrophobic because we're always right there in his face. This could be let's say, tiring or boring or monotonous. But Shakespeare, or not Shakespeare, Hemingway puts in he strikes a note early to work against that just a little bit, to work against that monotony. There is only a single sustained perspective, broader than that tight close up. He offers a vista in the beginning of the book when Santiago is first going out to sea. It's after all of the opening stuff with Manolo. He is now woken up before dawn, and he is pushing out into the water for the day's fishing ahead. He says, "Sometimes someone would speak in a boat, but most of the boats were silent except for the dip of the oars. They spread apart after they were out of the mouth of the harbor, and each one headed for the part of the ocean where he hoped to find fish. The old man knew he was going far out, and he left the smell of the land behind and rowed out into the clean early morning smell of the ocean. He saw the phosphorescence of the gulfweed in the water as he rowed over the part of the ocean that the fishermen called the Great Well, because there was a sudden deep of 700 fathoms where all sorts of fish congregated, because of the swirl the current made against the steep walls of the floor of the ocean. Here there were concentrations of shrimp and baitfish, and sometimes schools of squid in the deepest holes, and these rose close to the surface at night, where all the wandering fish fed on them." Which is a remarkable little passage in this moment. It's very evocative. We're starting the beginning with sound. The boats are all leaving in the dark, and you can't really see anything, but you can hear one another within this kind of abyss. Very suggestive in that. Hemingway then creates the illusion of scope with diction, like spread apart and far out, and then from the sudden deep, steep walls to close to the surface of the night. This sense of this language of space, of openness, of enormity, and broad vistas, that is completely in contrast to everything else in this story, completely absent from all the rest of the narrative. This is a note that he strikes very early in the story, right at the beginning of the voyage, and then that sort of lingers in the air throughout, so that by the end of the journey, when you have been in his face the entire time, you're still appreciative that, okay, this close-up has meaning. This close-up is significant because it is not the only way of viewing this. I have experienced the openness of that previous vista. It creates that sense of optimism also that sets up the high point from which Santiago's tragedy will, vertiginously drop. The moment of it calls, in its singularity, it calls attention to itself, and calls attention then, by contrast, to the limited focalization of everything else. All of that intensity on Santiago is in direct contrast to the openness and the immensity of pushing out to sea at that moment when you are hopeful of a new day. And that's the spirit that Santiago takes with him to each new day's fishing. And we're supposed to understand that he wouldn't, if he thought that every day was going to be tragic, he might not go out. But even if he does think that, he has the courage to go out with the expectation, or at least the hope and the prayer that maybe this day will bring fish. Maybe this day will bring bounty instead of the scarcity that we're always trying to muddle through with. The fact that never returns is part of the drama, and I would say it's almost the bulk of the drama. The intensity of the close-up on Santiago's hands and his back and the scars as he's enduring this awful torture out there, those take on greater meaning when contrasted to the wide shot of that horizon opening up on a new dawn. And it makes the pain of those moments, the pain of that intensity, so much more acute. The end of the novel offers yet another really significant passage, I would say, for just pure Hemingway-esque beauty and signification. Taking it up from after he has been towed out and he was very close to landing the fish or dying himself. He knows this. He says to himself, "Fish," the old man said, "fish, you are going to have to die anyway. Do you have to kill me too?" That way nothing is accomplished, he thought. His mouth was too dry to speak, but he could not reach for the water now. I must let him get alongside this time, he thought. I am not good for many more turns. Yes, you are, he told himself. You are good forever. Notice the back and forth, the conversation with himself. Some words he speaks out loud, but he answers then in his head, so it becomes a kind of dialogue, which creates a little variety, but it also reminds you conspicuously that this is a dialogue, but it's all a dialogue in that very tight, very, very limited frame of one person. Again, that claustrophobia is just collapsing in upon himself. On the next turn, he nearly had him, but again the fish righted himself and swam slowly away. You are killing me, fish, the old man thought. But you have a right to. Never have I seen a greater or more beautiful or a calmer or more noble thing than you, brother. Come on and kill me. I do not care who kills who. Now you are getting confused in the head, he thought. You must keep your head clear, and know how to suffer like a man. Or a fish, he thought. Note the parallelism between the two of them again, the man and the fish. Note the emphasis on courage and keeping a clear head, also very Hemingway. Clear up, head, he said in a voice he could hardly hear. Clear up. Twice more it was the same on the turns. I do not know, the old man thought. He had been on the point of feeling himself go each time. I do not know, but I will try it once more. He tried it once more, and he felt himself going when he turned the fish. The fish righted himself and swam off again slowly, and with the great tail weaving in the air. I'll try it again, the old man promised, although his hands were mushy now and he could only see well in flashes. He tried again, and it was the same, so he thought, and he felt himself going before it started. I will try it once again. He took all the pain and what was left of his strength and the long-gone pride and put it against the fish's agony, and the fish came over into his side and swam gently on his side, the bill almost touching the planking of the skiff, and started to pass the boat, long, deep, wide, silver, and barred with purple, and interminable in the water. The old man dropped the line and put his foot on it and lifted the harpoon as high as he could and drove it down with all his strength. And more strength he had just summoned into the fish's side, just behind the great chest fin that rose high in the air high in the air to the multitude of the man's chest, to the altitude of the man's chest. He felt the iron go in, and he leaned on it and drove it further, and then pushed all his weight after it. Then the fish came alive with his death in him, and rose high out of the water, showing all his great length and width, and all of his power and his beauty. He seemed to hang in the air above the old man in the skiff. Then he went into the water with a crash that sent spray over the old man, and fell over all of the skiff, and over all of the skiff. The old man felt faint and sick, and he could not see well, but he cleared the harpoon line and let it run slowly through his raw hands, and, when he could see, he saw the fish was on its back, with its silver belly up. The shaft of the harpoon was projecting at an angle from the fish's shoulder, and the fish was discoloring, and the red of the blood from his heart, with the red of the blood from his heart. First it was dark as a shoal in the blue water, that was more than a mile deep. Then it spread like a cloud. The fish was silvery and still, and floated with the waves. This is essentially a crucifixion of the fish, and the parallelism of the fish and the old man is repeated. So that is kind of obvious too. They are both in essence being crucified here. That is over the top, arguably, but notice again how it's so specific, so physical. We're told the color of the fish. We're told the actions of the fish. We're not given too many metaphors here. We're not given too many similes here. We're not told that it is like this or like the other thing. We're told that this just happened, and the action of converting that into a greater significance is all on us as readers. And that's Hemingway. That is what he learned from the Gospels. That is what he learned from reading the Hebrew Bible. That simple law of minimalism, drawn through very precise and structured, physical, exact narrative that conveys a significance beyond itself, but only through suggestion, through the suggestion of something else, by rigidly saying, no, it is only this, it is only this, and relying on the readers, the audience, the believers to say, well, if it is only this, maybe that means that it's also something else. That's Hemingway. That's modernism. That is The Old Man and the Sea. That is ripe for a kind of lampooning that he brought in for himself on this. But it is in its way a kind of flawless exercise of technique. The meaning of the Old Man and the Sea is a matter of great conjecture. It is completely subjective, and critics have had a field day with it ever since. You can see the Christian symbolism going through this. You can see the self-congratulatory or self-pitying element of Hemingway, the great artist who is in the twilight of his career. He feels like he has been picked apart by critics, like the sharks picking at the carcass of the fish, just as he goes far out into the unknown and tries to do his work with honor and courage. He gets destroyed on the way back as well. All of this is kind of obvious. All of this has a kind of meaning that can be made rather trite. But the actual craft of Hemingway limits itself from this, because it stays so focused, and all of the suppositions that we have about it, all of the interpretations, all of the all of the lampooning we can do about cliche. Well, he isn't really speaking in cliches. We are bringing cliche interpretations to the matter. The matter is the matter, and Hemingway stays within that. He colors slightly outside those lines, arguably, when he starts talking about the when he makes too explicit the Christian symbolism of the hands being wounded. But he really does stick to that basic, in the main, he sticks to that basic formula of rigidly focusing on one thing, one limited physical material frame around his narrative, and everything else is a matter of what readers bring to it. Everything else is the immaterial outside the frame that we just cannot help dragging in.